Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Outdoor Art Club presentation. I'm Kathleen Taylor, and I'm working with Cherry Jones to bring you today's program. The relationship between dance and mental well-being with our speaker, Ben Needham-Wood. Every year, the Outdoor Art Club runs a public speakers series so that people like you have the opportunity to learn about topics as varied as the state of the city of Mill Valley to wildlife in Marin County. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. The club engages in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community. Our clubhouse, located in the heart of Mill Valley, was designed in 1904 by renowned architect Bernard Baybeck and is a registered historical landmark. It is available for rent to the public for weddings, memorials, meetings, and general celebrations. Please visit our website for more information. Before I turn this program over to today's program chair, please note that Zoom has two functions, one for chat and one for Q&A. Today, please use Q&A function only to send your questions to Ben anytime during his presentation. He looks forward to answering them at the end of the program. At this time, I would like to introduce today's program chair, Sherry Yoshizu. Sherry is a member of the Outdoor Art Club and program chair for today's event. Hi, Sherry.
Hi.
How are you? Good to see you.
Well. Thank you. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks for bringing this to us today. I'll let you take over.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sherry Yoshizu. On behalf of the Cultural Arts Committee at the Outdoor Art Club, I am thrilled to be introducing a very special guest speaker, Emmy Award-winning choreographer, filmmaker, and dance educator, Ben Needham-Wood, who is not only a talented dancer and an amazing teacher, but also a wonderful, warm-hearted person. Originally from the East Coast, Ben studied ballet from an early age and continued his dance education at the University of Cincinnati's College Conservatory of Music. Ben began his career as a company artist with the Louisville Ballet, where he performed a diverse repertoire of classical and contemporary works. It is in the realm of contemporary ballet where Ben found his true passion. And in 2013, Ben joined Smuin Contemporary Ballet in San Francisco, where he danced for 7 seasons. After 12 years on the professional stage, Ben retired from full-time performance at the end of the 2019-2020 season. He continues to be very active in choreography, dance education, and arts leadership and administration. The National Center for Choreography recently awarded Ben with a community commissioning residency in Akron, Ohio, to study how movement impacts our mental health. There he collaborated with world-class artists Sadie Brown and Weston Kruko, and interviewed experts in the fields of psychology and exercise science. Their research has fueled the launch of Ben's new company, Redirecting Dance, which aims to serve communities by using dance to address critical social issues like mental health. Ben has recently become engaged, congratulations, and has relocated from the Bay Area to Colorado. He is Zooming with us from his home in Colorado. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben.
It's my pleasure, and thank you very much, Sherry, for that introduction. And a huge thank you to the Outdoor Art Club for having me today. This is actually one of the first times I've been able to present my work, and so I'm really excited to start sharing a little bit more about what I've been looking at and the area that I hope we can start to invest a little more energy in as dance continues to move forward. So before we dive into a lot of the work that I've been doing, I do want to give you a little bit more background on how I found dance and what it was that really brought me to the point that I am today. So I am originally from Massachusetts, and when I was really little, I had a babysitter who was a teacher, or a dance teacher. And I remember going to see her recital, and I absolutely loved it. So I asked my mom, can I take dance classes? And at the time, she kind of looked at me and patted me on the head and was like, oh, that's cute, but nothing happened. And so it was about 2 years later that my little sister started taking dance classes. And I was standing in the lobby kind of watching through the window, just copying everything that they were doing. And of course, the dance teacher sees this little boy trying to do ballet in the lobby and invites me in. And that was my first experience with dance. I was immediately hooked. And so for me, there was something that I felt as soon as I started dancing that was totally new, and I felt empowered. I felt more like myself than I think I'd ever been. And I didn't understand why, but it gave me a lot of energy and a lot of excitement about the world. Fast forwarding a little bit, I was a really active kid. I played a lot of soccer, but then due to injuries, decided that I did really want to focus my energy on dance. And coming out of high school, I ended up going to the University of Cincinnati for college. Their College Conservatory of Music has a really awesome program that actually allows you to dance professionally in a full-time company while still earning your undergraduate degree. So while I was in Cincinnati, I actually was able to get a job with the Louisville Ballet in Kentucky, and that's where I started my career. What I was really grateful for is that the director at the time in Louisville was Bruce Simpson. And he is probably one of the most incredibly smart people I've ever met in my life. And he was an amazing mentor who taught me a lot about the history of ballet and how this art form developed from its earliest years. One of the big things that he introduced me to that I had not really known prior to joining Louisville was that ballet was really born out of symbolism. And there's a specific example I'd like to offer where if you've seen a full-length ballet production, usually it ends with the prima ballerina at the very end of the ballet in her tutu on point, doing all these turns, and her leg is whipping around. And those are the 32 fouettes, which is one of the most iconic movements in classical ballet. The technique of a fouette was actually designed to create an ascending spiral. And the reason why that was so significant is at the time it was created, that symbol was used to reflect a connection to the gods. So when you saw a prima ballerina doing 32 fouettes and just spinning, the audience felt like she was getting closer to the heavens. She was ethereal, she was more divine. And so that gave ballet a sense of magic that allowed people to just disappear into it. And so that's just like one example of how symbolism really connected to how ballet was able to evolve. Another, probably the most significant mentor that I had though was my mom. And from the time I was a little kid, she was always a really active force in my life. And unfortunately, when I did join Louisville Ballet, my mom was diagnosed with inflammatory breast cancer. And it was while I was with the company that I was in my 5th season, and I was given the call that it was time to go home and be with my mom for her passing. In that moment, Louisville Ballet was getting ready to put on a production of Romeo and Juliet, which for me had always been my dream role. I think for almost any classical ballet dancer, if you have a chance to perform one of the title roles in Romeo and Juliet, that is absolutely everything. And so I went home and I was with my mom, and I got a call from Bruce Simpson, and he told me, Ben, we wanted to let you know that we've cast you as Romeo. And our hope is that you can share this with your mom before she passes. And so after getting off the phone, I did share that with my mom, and it ended up being one of the last things I was able to tell her. We go through her passing, and I return to Louisville, and the first thing we do is dive right into rehearsals for Romeo and Juliet. And in that moment, that ballet was probably the most physically, emotionally, spiritually cathartic healing process that I ever could have imagined. And I didn't know why it was so therapeutic for me, but there was something about dance that, once again, just like it did when I was 5 years old, it brought me a sense of self, a sense of wholeness that allowed me to move forward. And I knew there had to be something more to dance that I didn't yet understand. And so that kind of inspired me to see what else was possible in the dance world. And I auditioned for Smuin Contemporary Ballet in San Francisco and got the job. So I decided after that year to see where that would take me. So I moved to San Francisco. And when I got there, I met one of my absolute best friends, Weston Kruko. And we started doing things where outside of our regular work, we would start pursuing other projects or just trying to see what else we could create. And one of the big things we created was called Base Ballet Into the Game, which was a half-hour feature that paralleled ballet with baseball in order to showcase the athleticism of dance, our hope was that by creating this feature, we would inspire baseball fans to start appreciating ballet in a way that would actually encourage more ticket sales and more interest in the community. That went really, really well. And we actually were recognized with 4 regional Emmy Awards for that production. And that opened up a whole new door of opportunity for me, both in choreography and in film production. And so at the end of my performance career, I had been dancing for 12 years and I was ready to retire. My expectation was to go into choreography and production full time. And then right when I was about to retire, the pandemic hit. And so the jobs that would normally be available for a choreographer or filmmaker all got shut down because of the pandemic. And it led to this moment of trying to understand, with the career that I had built in the performing arts, how could I use that in a different way to still try to make an income, still try to have a livelihood, but continue being invested in the art that is my passion. And that's what ultimately led to this reflection, realizing that when I was a little kid, dance did something more for me. And then I knew there was this depth of symbolism that Bruce had introduced me to that had to be inherently in dance somewhere. And then I had that experience of losing my mom that dance became my therapy through. And so I decided that it was time. I wanted to research and try to see if I could understand how movement and dance actually could be used as a therapeutic modality. And is there research that proves that this is something valuable for society? So one of the first people that I talked to about this idea was Christy Bolingbroke, who's the executive director of the National Center for Choreography in Akron, Ohio. And when I told her about the work that I was interested in pursuing, she immediately told me about this residency that they were developing, where artists could propose a course of study. And if selected, they would be given an on-campus residency where they could go into Ohio, bring in collaborators, and they could actually dig into the research that they wanted to discover. And so I decided so I did the application, I was accepted. And when I went there, I of course brought my best friend, Wes Kruko, because we seemed to do well together. And I was able to also invite Sadie Brown to come join me and be a part of that process. And Sadie was an incredible artist of Aspen Santa Fe Ballet. Wes had been with an American in Paris, and the two of them together were just totally open books to this entire endeavor. And so we showed up in Akron and we discovered that one of the great coincidences of Akron, Ohio, is that it also happens to be home to the nation's only museum on the history of psychology. So we were able to go to the Cummings Center on the history of psychology and actually dig through the archives of what research has been done in mental health that connects to movement. And then we got to look through their exhibits, learn more about that. And we had all these interviews with experts in psychology and exercise science and nutrition. And what we did at the end of every single day was we took that research we had been doing and we went into a studio for several hours and we started creating movement directly derivative of that research. And so this all continued to evolve throughout those 2 weeks. And by the end of it, we had created this new duet performed by Wes and Sadie that really reflected the entire journey that we had shared in those 2 weeks and what we had learned about our bodies. So before we actually dive into all the research stuff, I do want to do a quick little exercise with us. And I should say that I'm actually borrowing this exercise from something that Christy Bolingbroke, the director of NCC Akron, told me about. She was in a meeting that was introduced by a woman named Sandra Malling. And Sandra Malling did this exercise about finding the back of your chair. And this connects directly to the work that Sadie, Wes, and I were doing. So wherever you are, I'm imagining most of us are sitting down. So wherever you're sitting, just kind of sit up a little bit wherever you are and lean back into your seat, into your chair if you have a backrest. If you don't have a backrest, don't lean back too far. But while you're sitting here, just kind of trace the back of your chair or the back of your space with your spine, almost like you're trying to read Braille or something like that. Once you feel like you've kind of mapped the back of your chair, go ahead and roll your shoulders open and open your palms up and kind of either place them down on the armrest next to you or on top of your thighs and see if you can do the same mapping with your shoulder blades. Then the last piece of this invitation is see how it feels when you just kind of stretch your neck forward and then tip your head back, just really getting a nice long stretch through the neck. And do this stretch a few times forward and back, working through. So this idea for opening this webinar kind of with this movement is actually a subconscious trick that I'm employing from some of the research that Sadie West and I learned. Your body has natural postures that actually impact your receptiveness to the world around you or to what you're hearing. And so sitting back, opening your shoulders, that creates an openness that makes you more accepting of whatever someone else is about to say. And vertical movements like nodding your head, like stretching your neck forward and back, actually send subconscious signals to the brain that you're going to agree with and believe whatever the person is telling you. So this little exercise of sitting back, opening up, nodding the head is my way of trying to coax you into believing everything that I'm about to say. I promise you it is in good faith. These are things that I have really researched, and this is study that I genuinely know has had a major impact on my life. But I just thought that would be a fun little way of, before I talk forever, of just kind of stretching that out. So with that, let's go ahead and dive into the research a bit. With anything in life, I think it's really important to understand the context of whatever it is that we're studying. And so before we started to understand the movement side of our study, I wanted to know a little bit more about the history of mental health treatment. And so I started kind of looking back at what are the earliest examples of this treatment. And what I found is that before we understood mental health, the belief was that you were either physically ill or you were possessed. There was no such thing as mental illness. And the earliest remedies for possession date back to 5000 BC, and it's a form of treatment called trephination, where they literally would remove part of someone's skull and take their brain out. And so that right there, clearly, it wasn't the most educated assessment of possession, but that was the earliest record that we have of how people tried to treat a mental issue. And that was really the only option that people had for about 4,000 years until 1000 BC. We started to see shifts where the practices of bloodletting and purging became really popular. So instead of removing someone's brain, they would open up your veins and actually pour blood out of your body, or they would force you to vomit so much that you had nothing left in your system. And so what's interesting to me is that this whole approach to possession was about purging your system of physical things. There was a really interesting case that actually happened in 1518. So this is another 2,500 years later. But there's an interesting case that's referred to as the dancing plague of 1518. And what happened was in Strasbourg, which at the time was part of the Holy Roman Empire, this woman just like for some reason could not stop moving. And it looked like she was dancing, but there was no music, there was no reason for it, and she just couldn't stop. And people kept going over to try to help her, try to figure out what was going on. And they then suddenly couldn't stop moving either. And there ended up being about 400 people in Strasbourg who were involuntarily dancing throughout the town. And several of them ended up dying from heart attack or overexertion. And this exact case happened in 3 other cities around the same time, one in Germany, one in Switzerland, and one in Holland, I believe. And this was all referred to as the dancing plague of 1518. And there's no medical understanding of what was actually going on, but what they believed at the time was that all these people, for some reason, their blood was boiling. And so they believed that because they had boiling blood, that was forcing everyone to dance and move when they didn't want to. This condition ends up being referred to later on in medicine as chorea, which for me, as soon as I see that, I immediately think choreography. And so this is just like one example where I think that I just was really fascinated by the idea of this boiling blood connecting to the practice of bloodletting that was so prevalent 2,000 years before. So fast forwarding a little bit through the other treatments that became really popular, when they realized that purging your system of these physical things was not working, the next practice that was introduced in the 1600s was isolation, where anyone who was dealing with a mental illness was really confined or sent out into the woods. And this is where there did start to be recognition that it wasn't just possession, but there was something about mental wellness that could be addressed. That didn't seem to work, so then they started constraints instead, and so that became the straitjacket or the Utica crib. And it wasn't until 1896 that the idea of psychoanalysis was actually introduced by Sigmund Freud. At the time, it didn't make a huge impact on the field, and it wasn't believed to be an absolute cure or the right way to approach mental wellness. But it was the first time that the idea was introduced that by talking to someone and by trying to work through what their thoughts are, you could actually start to get at the core of what was going to be important for them, or what was going to help them heal. A couple decades later, medicine shifted and they decided to try insulin coma therapy, where they induced people to pass out. And then metrazole therapy came right on the heels of that, where instead of passing out, it was inducing seizures. And that led up to the lobotomy, which lobotomy for me is really interesting, that we started with trepanation, where it was lodging out someone's brain, and suddenly we have come back to it literally thousands of years later. I think it kind of shows we still didn't really know what we were working with or what we were doing, but the lobotomy was actually recognized with Nobel Prizes, and it was the most popular form of treatment for mental wellness for a couple of years, until it was deemed inhumane and immediately stopped. And that then led to electroshock therapy, which again kind of did the same thing, but then eventually in 1955 was the introduction of antipsychotic drugs. And antipsychotic drugs were a massive breakthrough, because that was the first actual treatment where they could do research, they could collect data and show that it was actually having a benefit on people who were dealing with mental illness, or people who were mentally unwell. And so antipsychotic drugs are still currently probably the most prominent form of treatment for people who are struggling with their mental health. But now there is a new interest in talk therapy. It is starting to become more prevalent. And that really leads us to where we are today. The last thing that I really want to call out with this slide is recognizing that where we still are, there is a massive stigma against mental health. It's really hard to talk about for a lot of people. And if we look at this history of treatment and how barbaric and inhumane so many of the treatments were, literally locking people into themselves, sending them away from the rest of society, physically affecting their body, it's super inhumane, and it makes sense that no one would want to admit that they were struggling with any mental unwellness. And so the other thing that's also commonly talked about now is this idea of generational trauma. And if we look at how many thousands of years the mentally ill have been mistreated, it makes total sense that this stigma is so ingrained in our society that it's really hard to redirect. So when did we start to connect our bodies to our emotions? The first example of us actually understanding that there is a connection between our physical actions and our emotions came from Charles Darwin in 1872. And he was the first person to argue that the origins of emotional feelings actually start in the body. He had a study where he was looking at animal behavior and then comparing that to the way we are as humans. And he recognized that there were these physical postures and these facial expressions that were done by animals that regularly communicated what they were feeling. And he believed that the same thing was then possible, or was untrue, within humanity, where we all have these physical sensations that cause us to think and emote in different ways. Fast forward about 100 years, and that brings us to the first time that psychology as a whole really did start to research the understanding of our body's capacity for emotional regulation. And there are two main studies that really contributed to what we now know about how our bodies do affect our mental wellness. The first of which was by Paul Ekman in 1992. And what he did is he conducted a study where he recognized that there are actually universal facial expressions that directly reflect the emotions of what we're feeling. And these are not things that we're taught, these are just natural results in the body. And so that work right away said that there is something that is subconscious about the way that our physical self is connected to our mind. So there is a direct connection. And it was his work that actually introduced the concept of micro expressions. I don't know if you remember, but there was a show that was really popular on TV, probably, I want to say 10 years ago, called Lie to Me, maybe 15, something like that. And the whole premise of the show was that there was a guy who's essentially a human lie detector. And so the picture on your bottom right is of that actor from that series. And it's recognizing that there are these little tiny facial twitches that can actually indicate whatever that person is thinking in their mind. So we know that our faces can communicate that. That study was then expanded on about 20 years later by, I know I'm going to butcher his name, Neil Dahl, or Dale. My apologies, Professor. And his study in 2012 looked at how body actions and postures are crucial in emotional communication. And so that's just taking what we did with our face, but actually applying it to our full physical self and knowing that there are physical gestures that start to communicate exactly how people are feeling. So these are the two studies that really led to most of the work that we now understand about how our bodies are connected to our minds. And it was that last study about our body actions and postures that for me was so interesting when it connects to dance. My belief has always been that dance essentially takes body language and amplifies its expressive qualities. And so if we're taking body language, we're making it art. And if we look at dance, what I'm going to offer right now is just the reflection that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of forms of dance in the world. The two that I know the best are ballet and hip hop. Those are the two that I've studied. So for my examples, I'm really going to stick to those just because they're what I know. But a lot of what we're talking about can be applied to pretty much every other form of dance. But so if we look at this work that was done to understand how gestures and postures and body actions affect our human communication, and then we apply that to classical ballet, in every major classical ballet full-length production, like Romeo and Juliet, like Giselle, these major classics, there are always scenes that are about storytelling. And whenever it gets to the storytelling, the dancers are doing what's called mise en scene, and they're performing these gestures that communicate different narrative lines. And all of those pantomimes that are being executed are directly derivative of the same body postures and actions that were studied by Dale and his team. Taken from a different perspective, classical ballet is iconic for the amount of external rotation and extension that exists within that discipline. So rather than standing with your feet parallel, they're turned out and rotated. And a lot of us, when we think of ballet, we picture someone leaping through the air with their legs really stretched out, the arms go back really big. And what's interesting to me is if you look at the picture in the top right of this slide, there's a person who's kind of jumping this way. That from the study in 2012 was actually identified as a universal symbol for joy. So when you see a ballerina leap through the air and the arms go up and the legs go out, that full extension, it in a way is kind of like the fullest embodiment of joy. It's an idealized form of what joy can be in physical manifestation. And so audiences sitting there watching a ballet dancer perform these big movements, it looks like they are in the most joyous place they could possibly be. And so in that, I think it captivates them. Looking at the exact opposite side of the spectrum, if we go into the hip hop world, there's a form of hip hop dance that's called crumping. And crumping started in South Central LA. And it was a real severe time of depression. And there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of violence in the city. And there was a guy named Tommy the Clown who started basically dressing like a clown, painting his face, and going to birthday parties dancing for people. And he started his own dance style. People within his community then loved his style, sort of mimicking it, but they felt so much anger and turmoil from the life they were leading that they started using it actually as a physical expression of their stress and of their trauma. So instead of these big extended movements, they started doing things that are contracted and pulled in and tight. And the idea behind crumping was that you took all this negative energy that was bottled up inside of you and you would release it and then you would catch it and bring it right back. And so what those contractions engage are the same muscles and the same body signals that actually signal our fight, flight, freeze response. And so this is a totally opposite example where people were then using dance not to express the biggest joy, but to actually physicalize what they're feeling in a way to process it, to let it out of their bodies without turning it into a violent act. So the question kind of comes up with all that. We're doing these dances that have these connections to our mind, but where does it all start? Does it start, as Charles Darwin was indicating, in the body and then go to the mind? Or can we think about how we want to move, and does that then create an impact? And what studies have been showing is that it actually does work both ways. And so you can make a choice to say, okay, I want to be happy. I'm going to smile. I'm going to stand up tall. And that decision will actually engage your body in a certain way that allows you to start genuinely feeling better. Or at the same time, you can be sitting there with your shoulders hunched down, or if you're stuck staring in front of a Zoom all day and you get to the end of the day and you don't know why you feel tired and down, and it's because you've been sitting here with the shoulders caved in and your chin forward, which is a body's posture symbolic for depression. So we can subconsciously have the same impact on our mental wellness. And it's a cycle. And what has become one of the most predominant thoughts within the mental health space is this idea that there are a lot of different variables between different people that will ultimately affect mental wellness. And we know that our mind-body connection works both ways, but there are a lot of other factors that are at play with it too. And that major breakthrough or perspective is referred to as the 8 dimensions of wellness. So the 8 dimensions of wellness are your physical, emotional, intellectual, occupational, financial, social, environmental, and spiritual wellness. And the idea is that these are 8 different facets of your life that ultimately will have an impact on how your emotional wellness is, or how your personal wellness is, we should say. And none of them function on their own. You could be super physically fit, you could have a great social atmosphere, but if you have a job that you really don't like and it's a negative environment and you're financially strapped, you will probably still be struggling personally. Or it could be the exact inverse, where you have this great job, great finances, all these things could be wonderful, even if, let's just say that your job is not very good. You don't like your job at all, but you feel emotionally stimulated elsewhere, intellectually stimulated, physically, environmentally. If all the other 7 are great, even if one's not very good, you'll probably still be doing pretty well. And they all kind of pull at each other. And so the idea with the 8 dimensions of wellness is that finding true wellness happens when all 8 of these have found a balance. And that balance is different for everybody based on your own personal experiences, your own personal well-being and preferences. But it's the idea of connecting all of these that lets us understand our best wellness. So I've now been talking for a little while, so I want to give us a little activity to do with this idea. So for yourself, let's take like a minute to do this. And if you want to get something to write it down with, awesome. Or you can literally just sit here and think about these things and reflect on it. But take about a minute right now, and I want you to briefly describe for yourself each of your dimensions of wellness in a typical week. So if you're looking at a week, Monday to Sunday, how does that week typically go? What is your work life like? What is your social like? What is your social life like? How physically active are you? And just kind of, I'm gonna zip my lip for a minute and just give yourself about a minute to kind of think through these pieces or write them down about what a typical week is like for you. Awesome. So even if you haven't gone through all of them, that's totally fine. This is also an activity you can do for yourself later. But for the different dimensions of wellness that you've been able to think through in this time, go through and kind of rate each of those on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being not at all, 5 being a ton, on how physically active they are. So whatever that dimension of wellness is that you've been thinking through, or whichever ones those are, go ahead and kind of just evaluate those for a couple seconds on how active they are, 1 through 5. And then the next piece, once you've kind of evaluated those that way, is I would go through each of those same dimensions of wellness, and again, scale of 1 to 5, 1 being awful, 5 being amazing. Think for yourself, how do each of those dimensions make you feel? So like, how do you feel in each of those 8 dimensions of your life? So again, you might not have gotten through all 8 dimensions, and that's totally okay. This is something you could do later. But with the ones you were able to get through, what I'd be curious about is for yourself, just reflecting on if there is any similarity between how physically active they are and how they make you feel. So that I think is just an interesting line to look at, that for my life has actually lined up pretty well. I'm also a little bit different in that almost all of my life is very active because of dance. But there's another angle to this that I'd like to call some attention to. With the dimensions of wellness that you're thinking through, were there one or two that actually made you feel stressed? The ones that make you feel awful or bad, did you notice when you started thinking about them if your breath rate changed, if your chest got a little bit tighter, or if your heart rate changed at all within that? So this is where it gets kind of interesting for me, is that we actually have bodily signals when something is upsetting us or is not in balance and in harmony with the rest of our dimensions of wellness, that creates a conflict that our body communicates to our brain is off. And this kind of leads me into what are like some of the benefits of physical movement. And so there are a lot of benefits that have been shown in movement through recent studies. And one of the main ones that is now starting to become pretty common knowledge is that movement does reduce stress and anxiety. So how does that work? When we feel stressed or anxious, what our body's typical response to that is to increase our heart rate. So our chest starts pounding, and then our lung capacity tightens. So our breaths get shorter and a little bit faster as well. All the rhythms internally pick up, and it creates this tense and anxious moment, and that can lead to panic attacks. It's also what triggers our fight, flight, freeze response in our nervous system, especially for people who are victims of a physical abuse of some kind or something like that, who have had a personal physical trauma. Those get really active and engaged. The deal with exercise and movement is that exercise and movement actually trigger the same bodily reactions. Your heart rate increases because you're pumping more blood through your system. Your lungs have to work faster to oxygenate your blood so that your blood oxygen levels stay well. And what essentially happens is that process of doing physical exercise induces the same communication to the brain, but it recognizes that it's not threatening. So instead of our brain receiving this quickened heart, this tighter chest as something that it needs to be wary of, all of a sudden it becomes non-threatening. We can deal with it, we can process it, we don't get as overwhelmed. So that's which allows us to disassociate from those sensations. And that's really how movement helps to reduce stress and anxiety. Another big benefit of movement is that movement produces, and this is also relatively common knowledge at this point, it produces endorphins, serotonin, and dopamine in our brain. And this is where antipsychotic drugs were super effective, is that they were some of the first tools that actually were able to introduce or to help balance these 3 things in our physiology. And so essentially endorphins, are known to reduce pain and stress. Serotonin helps to regulate mood, digestion, and sleep. And then dopamine is a neurotransmitter that can increase mood and impact decision-making. So antipsychotic drugs help to level out these 3 pieces of our brain chemistry in order for us to more properly function. And they all work on different levels. They affect people different ways. But this is another big thing, that movement also produces these 3 things. And so movement can be an alternative to medications in helping the body produce these chemicals. The last thing that I wanted to call attention to that we have been able to show that movement can do is that movement generates something that's known as brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so we're going to refer to that as BDNF. And BDNF is a protein that's produced in the brain and the spinal cord that supports memory and learning. And it's BDNF production that is typically, that is the reason why movement and dance classes specifically have been shown to support patients with Alzheimer's or dementia. What naturally happens in our body is that BDNF is really highly produced until we're about 30 years old, and then its production drops way off. And exercise and movement is one of the only natural ways that has been shown to actually increase that production within us. So these are 3 different ways that our bodies naturally can produce things that can produce benefits for us internally. But what's been really fascinating to me to learn about is how, beyond just the internal benefits that we can personally feel from movement, there's a whole other side to our connection that we can actually look at affects our interactions with one another and our interpersonal relationships. And that's known as limbic synchrony. Limbic synchrony is something that is based on mirror neurons, which were discovered in our brain a couple decades ago. And mirror neurons are brain cells that react when a particular action is either performed or observed. And so if you have played baseball or something like that before, and you know what it feels like to swing a bat and hit a ball, and then you watch someone playing baseball and you see them go through that motion, your brain recognizes exactly what they were doing and triggers the same neural reaction in your own body. That's what mirror neurons allow us to do. This is something that actually starts at birth. When babies are born, they naturally go through a process of limbic synchrony with their mother, where they match their heart rate and their breathing rate so that feels totally aligned. And that synchronicity is why babies feel so close to their mother from birth. This exact study has been applied pretty regularly now to business relations, where people who are trained to be successful in a business conversation recognize that your body language is a large contributor to the success of any interaction. And what they often are taught is to mimic the body language of the person next to them because it creates a sense of likeness. And the more you create a physical likeness, you feel familiar to them. And that similarity triggers signals in the brain that say that we can trust that other person. What's interesting about limbic synchrony to me is that it can be both a conscious and a subconscious choice. So if you go into, let's say you're sitting down to have a meeting with somebody, one person understands limbic synchrony and they're actively moving their posture to be able to reflect the person next to them. If the other person doesn't know what's going on, they might start to actually think differently than how they were feeling at first. Maybe they came into the meeting and were feeling uncomfortable, but for some reason they feel really open and excited. That's because the limbic synchrony that happens subconsciously through the mirror neurons allows them to acclimate to the other person. And that one person is actively engaging it, the other is subconsciously receiving it, and it will shift the mood and the interaction between the two of them. So this for me is where I think the real power of performance art finds its source, in that limbic synchrony that's possible. Limbic synchrony is essentially why dance performances or live performances where you see another person on stage performing with these big emotive roles, why that hits an audience member so personally. If you've ever had that experience where you're watching someone on stage and they're going through this moment of sheer heartbreak, or on the opposite side, something that is absolutely exuberantly joyful, those motions, if you leave the theater feeling like that performer did, then they were using their body, their postures, their gestures, in order to actually connect to the same emotional core that you have. The difference is that because it's through physical movement, it doesn't have to be specific to the context of the situation. It's just about the emotional line and the physical feeling. So you might be watching a story like Romeo and Juliet, but what it might be connecting to for you is an interaction you had with a coworker where you felt bad because they were going through something, but it hit you in a similar way as some of the feelings that were presented on stage and that. And so this is where art therapy really has a lot of value, especially with performance art, is because it becomes a safe way to introduce the emotional feelings without getting overwhelming by getting too specific about what someone actually is going through. So someone seeing a show might need to work through some personal trauma, but if they can look at a different circumstance that has the emotion, they can outlet some of that emotion without having to really face the core of what their issue is. So it's like opening the floodgates just a little bit. And dance movement therapy is especially powerful for this because it is something that allows that fully physical self to really come forward. This is where I learned that my personal therapy and the reason why dance was so impactful in my life, really, this is where I understood why. When I was 5 years old, I was a victim of sexual abuse. And oftentimes for childhood victims of sexual abuse, you grow up with the feeling that your body is broken, that you are less than, and that you do not deserve to be on the same page as somebody else. You see your body as something to be ashamed of. And what happened for me is that right after that, I started dance. And dance instead helped me reprogram my relationship to my body in a way where I felt physically empowered. That physical dimension of wellness kicked in, and I felt like I could physically do these things. My body wasn't broken, it was actually powerful. And that made me emotionally happy and helped launch me into this realm where when I was dancing, I felt spiritually enlightened. And it was an intellectual challenge that allowed me to really see what I was capable of. And one of the biggest gifts in my life was that I did have a mom who, when she was in college, studied psychology and became a counselor. And so my mom was actually able to help counsel me through that time. And when I went to dance, which also became my social community, became the environment that I was growing up in, she helped to guide that process so that for me, it was a really healthy, nurturing, supportive place for growth. And so what I started to realize when I did this research is that as an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse, it was dance that actually allowed me when I was a kid to feel empowered. And it was because of the way that it physically impacted me. And because of the limbic synchrony, I was able to create with the other people in my social circle where I felt like I was a part of something. And then later on in life, when it became my job, when it checked off my occupational wellness, my financial wellness, when I was doing Romeo and Juliet, I was able to get through losing my mom, who had been the person who introduced all this to me from the very beginning, through the symbolism of dance that Bruce introduced me to. And that catapulted me to understanding that dance can be so much more. And there is so much that we can grow from when we embrace this art form in a way that can be therapeutic. The other big thing that my mother taught me was empathy. And this brings us right back to that limbic synchrony. The limbic synchrony, where dance allows us to connect with someone else on an emotional level, is also how dance can be a catalyst for social progress. And it is that capacity that dance holds that I think in a time like what we're facing right now, where so many people have been isolated from this pandemic, so many people had their physical activity cut off, if we can use dance and we can use the arts as a way to actually develop empathy through these physical actions that we know have been proved, where we know we can inspire people through physical modalities and through the power of the arts that introduce conversations where they can understand what each other are going through, we can help be part of the positive change and help it be in the mental progress that allows our communities to reconnect after such a segregated time. And so that's the sentiment that inspired me to start Redirecting Dance in the pandemic. And Redirecting Dance is my new company that is working to produce dance that inspires empathy and raises awareness around critical social issues. And I think right now, mental health is one of the most paramount issues that we face. And that, in a nutshell, is the work that we've been doing. Something that I do hope to make available to you, that dance that I mentioned in the very beginning that Wes and Sadie performed, we are in the process right now of continuing to develop it, and we want to produce that in full scale so that we can actually use that to elevate the reason why movement and mental health is so important and how we can use this as a therapeutic modality. So I'm going to try to see if there's a way for me to make that available to you all. But it's with that sentiment of the empathy that we can build with each other that I want to say thank you so much to the Outdoor Art Club and to all of you for tuning in to be a part of this conversation. And thank you for giving me the space to share my work. Just thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben, for your wonderful presentation. It looks like we have some questions from our audience. The first one is your work focused on dance communities specifically or the broader population as well?
Thank you very much for that question. The work that I've been doing has started focused on the dance community just because that's where I'm most intimately connected. But what we are looking to do is see how our research and how the work we're doing can actually be more broadly applied to others. So for example, we are looking at with this research how we can help to support dance education systems, dance schools, in reassessing their practices to introduce the mental health perspective in their studies. But then that exact same understanding of physical movement and how that supports mental wellness could be applied in a general academic setting. So we are looking at how we can take this research that we're still working to really make sure that we have a good curriculum developed around this, but we want to be able to offer that to people that are not dance-based as well.
Great. Our next question is, has your research changed your approach to choreography?
Oh, 100%, yes. I have always felt my most personal connection to choreography when it has been something that was emotionally centered for me. And I didn't always know the right gestures to make it really speak. And what was interesting to me is when I was in Ohio with Wes and Sadie, the choreography that we built was probably the work that I felt the most personally connected to. The understanding of how we can actually change our postures directly along an emotional line that's related to what we were literally feeling those days, whether one of us was having a really bad day and they needed support from the other person, and then it would shift the next day. The choreography actually reflected that in the way that we physicalized it. And that for me now, I've done another 4 choreographed works since then. And each one, as the movement is now coming forward, my thought first goes to what is the emotional core? What is the center of this gesture, of this action? And how does that relate to our mental understanding of what we're physically doing? And so that time with Wes and Sadie was absolutely crucial in my development. And I think it's absolutely changed all the choreography I produce now.
I think this next question refers to one of your 8 dimensions of wellness. It is, can you define environmental in your slide?
Sure thing. So environmental wellness relative to the 8 dimensions is kind of looking at what type of environment you feel most comfortable in. Is your environment overwhelming? Is it, do you prefer something that is quiet and tranquil? City living versus suburban life would be one way to kind of look at it, or if you want to be way out in the woods versus right in the heart of a city. But so it's kind of taking those broad spectrum perspectives of how would you describe your environment here? And is that what actually aligns with where you feel comfortable, or is it actually going against your natural place?
Great.
I hope that actually makes sense. I feel like I jumbled a little bit in there.
Our next question is, by increasing movement, have you seen people who are able to reduce the use of drugs for inflictions like anxiety?
Yes, directly. And actually there was another person that we talked to in Ohio, which I didn't mention before because it's a little bit tangential to this talk. Sadie, Wes, and I had a beautiful conversation with a man named Mark Lee Shannon. And he is someone who is a big advocate supporting those who are struggling with addiction. And what we talked about a lot is how difficult it can be when someone is struggling with addiction to find another outlet that actually lets them continue to feel like they're themselves. And I do have personal connections to people who have had to find medications in order to deal with stress and anxiety, who have gone down the wrong rabbit holes in different times in their life that were really dark. And we've all had our own processes like that, but it's through those relationships I have seen what happens when they do start to get physically active again, when they do start to move again. And consistently within all of that, there has been this sense of rebalancing their life, that even if it wasn't everything they needed, it was a very helpful tool. So I have definitely seen a direct positive correlation to movement with people who are dealing with forms of substance abuse or addiction.
Excellent. These are really great questions and answers, by the way. Our next question is, are you developing curriculum that could be used by teachers in the classroom?
Yes, it is probably a little ways out at this point. Part of the struggle in starting a new company during the pandemic is trying to find the funding to be able to do the research at the pace that we want to do is really difficult. And so, but what we do know is that all this work needs to be shared. Otherwise, why are we doing it? And so my goal is with this research for us to be able to present it and to actually offer a form of consultation that can help educational systems really understand more effective ways of teaching and of building positive environments for the well-being of the students.
Great. And there's one other question that asks if you can make the slide describing the different areas, rating their physical activity and how that makes one feel, available to those attending the webinar. And I know that this is being recorded, so all of our attendees will be able to rewatch it and see that slide again. So hopefully that is helpful.
Yeah, it definitely will be available. And one of the things that as I was mentioning before, that I do really want to be able to do for everyone is for all of you who are attending, my hope is to be able to share the dance that I was producing with Sadie and Wes to you all as well. So you can actually see how some of that movement was transformed through choreography. And so with that, I can probably try to also get a still frame of that one slide with the 8 dimensions of wellness. I will confess, if you actually go to a Google search and just type in 8 dimensions of wellness, it will actually give you a ton of different images that are essentially exactly what I put up on there. So that is another way that would be available to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ben, for Zooming with us today. Your talk has really helped to expand our understanding of how interconnected movement is with our minds and mental well-being. We can't wait to see what you discover in your new course of study, and we wish you all the best with your new company, Redirecting Dance, and your upcoming wedding.
Thank you very, very much. It's been an absolute joy getting to finally share a little bit more about my work in such a full form. And so just thank you, Sherry. Thank you to the Outdoor Art Club for having me here today. And another big thank you to everyone for tuning in to learn about the new company I'm trying to start and the work that we're hoping to bring to our communities. So just thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. The Cultural Arts Committee is excited to announce our next public speaking event, 108 Beloved Objects. It's a special solo performance by author, journalist, and ethical traveler, Jeff Greenwald. This event will happen on Thursday, March 31st at 1 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. When COVID-19 interfered with his travel assignments, Jeff creatively decided to take an inward journey from the luxury of familiar surroundings, his home. Jeff selected 108 objects around his home that had special meaning and decided to part with them, but hold on to their stories and their memories. Our program chair is none other than the fabulous Lynn Fabian Lasner, chair of the Cultural Arts Committee at the Outdoor Art Club. We hope you can join us. It has been lovely to spend time with you all. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.